Let's, as lawyers, clarify terms first. Because, at the founding, a lot of people used the term republic and republican as synonymous with popular sovereignty and majority rule. So if the question is, are we in the United States after the Constitution a system of direct democracy versus elected representation, I would say, just as is true of our economy, not being entirely capitalist and not being entirely a controlled economy, it's a mixture, it's a mix. So I'll just identify, to get the ball rolling, several features of our Constitution that lean in the direction of filtered or representative government, in which maybe not all individual citizens' voices are equal. And then talk about some other aspects of the Constitution that are more kind of obviously democratic in the sense in which I think you posed it. So the Constitution rejects direct democracy, that is initiative and referenda and everyone town hall lawmaking, with regard to federal legislation. So the Constitution creates a Congress, we elect Congress, we cannot instruct Congress, we cannot recall the members of Congress except at the next election. It also eschewed at the founding the decision to have a national popular vote election for president in favor of an electoral college. As we'll talk later, the Constitution does not prevent moves in the direction of a national popular election, but it certainly did not accept the invitation of James Wilson, for example, to have that feature built in at the outset. And both with regard to the electoral college that we currently have and the United States Senate, there is a malapportionment in which one person does not have the same one vote as everyone else around the country. On the other hand, the Constitution's ratification procedures were incredibly democratic. The Constitution itself was ratified in special conventions in each of the 13 states, and the people eligible to vote for representatives at those ratifying conventions was as wide a swath of the electorate as existed in any modern society at the time. The Constitution allows for direct election of members of the House of Representatives, and now, after the late 1800s and early 1900s, for the U.S. Senate as well. And the Constitution does not prescribe property or other qualifications to vote for members of the House. There's no literacy tests or religious oaths required. The Republican Guarantee Clause, the provision in the Constitution that guarantees to each state a Republican form of government, is, I think, best understood as requiring states to have majority rule and allowing states, preserving those aspects of state government that are directly democratic. So while the Constitution forecloses initiative and referenda at the federal level, it protects the rights of states to use the recall and the initiative and referenda. Whether that's always a wise decision is another matter, but the Constitution protects states in doing that, and indeed guarantees states that they will have a majoritarian form of government, not an oligarchical form of government. And that's why we have the one person, one vote principle from cases like Reynolds versus Sims and Baker versus Carr and Westbury versus Sanders that are in Randy's book. That in all elections, except currently the Senate election and the presidential election, which is really a series of 50 plus elections, every vote counts the same. And then finally, and importantly, and related to all of this, the Constitution itself delegates a lot of important power to the states to figure out how we select members of Congress and the president. So the state legislatures and the state peoples get to decide how to do congressional elections in the first instance at least, and how to appoint their electors to the so-called electoral college. So I would say there's a very complicated, rich blend that allows for a lot of flexibility, especially at the state level, even as relates federal institutions like the U.S. Senate and the presidency through the electoral college, as we'll probably get into.
Thank you so much for that. Randy, you just heard Vic's very thoughtful and nuanced answer, namely that we're both a democracy and a republic. We have blended elements of both, and he described them. Is there anything in his statement that you disagree with, and do you want to make the case that, in fact, we are a republic rather than a democracy?
I don't disagree with very much of what Vic said, but I nevertheless think it's useful to distinguish between a form of government that we could call Republican and a form of government we would call Democratic. And I'm going to do something that is not great for these proceedings, and that is I'm going to read a few quotes. And then once I've read them, I'm not going to read any more quotes again. So this will be the only time. So these are some quotes from the Philadelphia Convention, which happened right here, not very far from where we are today. At the Philadelphia Convention, Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General of the United States, observed that, quote, "The general object, meaning the purposes of writing a constitution, was to provide a cure for the evils under which the U.S. labored." And he then said, quote, "In tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy." Eldridge Gary from Massachusetts stated, "The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy." Roger Sherman of Connecticut contended that the people, quote, "immediately should have as little to do with as may be about the government." Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania noted that, quote, "Every man of observation had seen in the Democratic branches of the state legislatures precipitation, in Congress changeableness, in every department and excesses against personal liberty, private property, and personal safety." And finally, George Mason, who actually was among the more democratically inclined members of the Constitutional Convention, he said that he admitted that, quote, "We had been too democratic in forming state governments." Now, what was their problem? What did they mean by democracy? Well, it wasn't direct democracy. That wasn't what we had before under the Articles of Confederation. We had representative government under the Articles of Confederation, but it was a very majoritarian form of representative government. In other words, there was usually one house legislatures elected annually. If there is an upper house, it was elected by the lower house, again elected annually. The governor might actually be elected by the legislature itself, not popularly elected by the people as a whole. And so this is what they were responding to. And what was the problem that they saw with democracy? Well, they had some, outcome problems. They thought the country was in bad shape because of these things. There had been debtor relief laws passed and protectionist legislation passed and the inability to adhere to our treaties. There were quite a number of problems. But what they were primarily concerned with was the problem of majoritarianism. Madison, before he went to the Constitutional Convention, did something really quite remarkable. He wrote a position paper really for his own benefit, which goes under the title of The Vices of the American Political System, in which he tried to figure out something's wrong here, but what's wrong? What is what's going on that's wrong? And I'm just going to read two quotes from his own position paper that he wrote basically for himself, but you can read it now. He said, "The problems that we're facing today, the evil," he said, "that we're facing today, calls into question the fundamental principle of Republican government." And this gets to what Vic said, that Republican had a pretty democratic meaning, at least at first, before this happened. Calls into question the fundamental principle of Republican government, that the majority who rule in such governments are the safest guardians of both the public good and of the private rights. He basically he said, but that has not turned out to be the case. The majority has not turned out to be the safest guardian. And then to understand that, he posited a thought experiment. He said, place 3 individuals in a situation wherein the interest of each depends on the rights of the others, and give to 2 of them an interest opposed to the rights of the third. Will the latter, meaning the third person, be secure if he can be outvoted by the first 2? He said, the prudence of every man would shun the danger. Likewise, he said, will 2,000 in a like situation be less likely to encroach on the rights of 1,000? In other words, the problem that he diagnosed was one of majoritarianism. So, how does this translate to today? If you equate democracy with majority rule, and I'm going to argue that that is how the term is usually used. It's not usually used in the mixed way that Vic just did, but it's usually used in defense of majoritarianism, and I'll try to prove that in a second. If that is what you mean by democracy, then actually democracy or majoritarianism is not the solution to the problem of governance. It is the problem for which we have our Constitution as itself supposed to be solving. Our Constitution is supposed to be solving the problem of majoritarianism, the problem of democracy. That's not the solution. Now, why do I say this is what people tend to mean when they use the word democratic today? Well, downstairs in the bookstore, on the very same shelf that my book, Our Republican Constitution, appears, 3 books down is my good friend Sandy Levinson's book, Our Undemocratic Constitution. And I have to say that his book inspired me to write my book. It was a book review of his book, Our Undemocratic Constitution, that inspired me to write Our Republican Constitution, because in my book review I said, yes, Sandy's right. It is an undemocratic constitution. It's a Republican one, and here's why it's good. In his book, he highlights all the defects of the Constitution from a democracy standpoint, in his opinion, what the defects are. And so what is the beef? Well, let's take the Electoral College, for example. What is the objection we hear made about the Electoral College? Well, it's the possibility that a person who gains a majority of the electoral votes will not have gained a majority of the popular vote. And that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Because the majority didn't get their way. What's the problem with the Senate? That a majority of senators or a majority of senators representing a minority of the population might be able to block legislation that a majority of the people want. That's another, what's the problem with that? It's undemocratic. What makes it undemocratic? It's blocking the majority. So when the term democratic is used as a criticism for the various features that are in our Republican Constitution, the objection that's being made is it's not majoritarian enough. But my response is majoritarianism is itself a problem. It's not the only problem. There's the problem of minority rule. That's also a problem. And that's the reason why James Madison, in Federalist Paper number 10, identified the problem of faction as those people who are united by some common interest or of passion, be it a majority or a minority of the whole. They're actuated by some common interest or passion adverse to the rights of their fellow citizens or to the public good. That is the problem for which our Republican Constitution was adopted, our anti-majoritarian Constitution. But at the same time, let me say one last thing, because I know it's time to converse here. Our Republican Constitution does have what you would call democratic elements to it, like, for example, the House of Representatives and other elements that have become more majoritarian or democratic as time went by. What would be the value of that within a Republican Constitution? I think it does have a value. That is, within a Republican Constitution, the first thing that you're trying to look for is checks on power. Checks against minoritarian abuses, checks against majoritarian abuses. And one of the things that a Democratic branch like the House of Representatives provides, as well as popular elections provides, is a check on power. It isn't so much that the majority gets to rule, it's that the majority can provide a check on powers exercised either by themselves as a majority or a different majority or by a minority. So there is a role for what you would call democratic accountability even in a Republican Constitution, as long as we understand that the ultimate aim of a Republican Constitution, and I should have led with this, is not the reflection of majority will. That's the problem. What is the ultimate aim? It is to secure the unalienable rights of we the people, each and every one of us. And the next sentence in the Declaration of Independence, after it identifies those rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is it says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is the end and goal, to secure these rights, and everything else about our Republican Constitution, if it's a good Constitution, is there to preserve the rights of the people.